It's the Wonkhe Show. We're talking about big new appointments at UKRI and OFS, the rise in students' use of Gen AI, and possible changes to come for post-study work visas. It's all coming up.
Hiring people, which is something we would like to do. We would like to hire international students, international graduates rather, where they are the right people for the job. It's incredibly hard and incredibly frustrating. It takes a lot of time, and it's a mess. Don't make it worse.
Welcome back to the Wonkhe Show, your weekly way into this week's higher education news, policy and analysis. I'm your host, Mark Leach, and joining me for another fireside HE policy chat this week, we have three fantastic guests as always. In Sheffield, it's Mark Bennett, Director for Audience and Insight at FindAUniversity. Mark, your hard of the week, please.
I'm going to be a little bit cheeky and pick two, actually. So professionally, it's seeing lots and lots of excited and eager, prospective postgrads at our study fairs this week. But personally, I'm off to a hardcore punk gig tomorrow in a mosh with my wife, so I'm looking forward to that as well.
And in London, it's Sarah Cowan, Head of Policy for Higher Education Research at the British Academy. Sarah, your heart of the week, please.
Not as exciting as Mark. My highlight of the week was going to be getting tickets to the Women's World Cup for rugby, but I have failed spectacularly. So instead it'll be looking forward to watching it in the pub come summer.
And in Oxford, it's Michael Salmon, Wonkhe's news editor. Michael, your heart of the week, please.
Hi everyone. I think my professional highlight, at least, has been watching a very, very interesting and sort of, very, very in-depth committee hearing in the Scottish Education Committee talking about widening access. It's really, perked me up and also made me think, why is Westminster never like that?
Great. So we start the week with two big appointments. Michael, walk us through it, please.
Yes. So this morning in the last hour, the government has confirmed their preferred candidates to take on the chairship of the Office for Students, and it is Nottingham Trent University Vice-Chancellor Edward Peck. He had already announced he was stepping down soonish from the university. He's also the Department for Education's student mental health champion. I think he's someone who the sector will be incredibly pleased with, especially if you see that, really he is the permanent replacement for James Wharton, the Tory peer, if people can cast their mind back, who resigned shortly after the general election, a much more favourable candidate for the sector. And also this week on Monday morning, we got the news that the government has finally chosen a candidate to be the chief executive of UK Research and Innovation, UKRI. That's going to be Ian Chapman. He is and has been for quite a long time the CEO of the UK Atomic Energy Authority. He's a very serious scientist, background in sort of nuclear fusion, plasma physics, lots of complicated stuff, and he's also someone who as far as I can tell from a non-expert perspective, has a very good track record of sort of delivering infrastructure and managing public money. Again, if we see what the Conservatives had been floating around their sort of preferred candidate, they were talking about, they sort of wanted someone a bit more business-like, someone from outside to, just tear things up. I think, again, he's someone that the sector will be very pleased with.
Yes. So I think, the common thing, isn't there, that these are two appointments that, no one or very few people in the sector are going to be unhappy about. And it's quite a journey we've been on since James Wharton, isn't it, in terms of OFS? I think, a Tory peer closely tied to then Prime Minister Boris Johnson and his agenda, to a former Vice-Chancellor, is about the best the sector could have hoped for, I think. Sarah, do you think this sort of indicates the, a next step in the chapter of the kind of re-establishing, the normalising, the bettering relations between government and the sector bodies and agencies and funders, and the sort of, a bit of a realignment?
You would hope so. I mean, Edward's got a great track record of those strong relationships, both between the sector and the government, and thinking about kind of the student experience. I think what it signals for me, though, is that there's been a lot of hope within the sector that OFS would start to think more about its responsibility as a regulator, and perhaps a little bit less about its focus on student experience. And obviously Edward brings that student experience background. So what it means for OFS's strategy that they're currently consulting on, I think that remains to be seen.
I mean, Mark, there's a lot there for him to pick up, and the Bean report into OFS and what it needs, how it needed to change, as Sarah said, for a greater focus on regulation. There's a bit of a blueprint for Edward Peck to pick up and run with, isn't there?
Definitely. I mean, frankly, I'll try and speak politely about this, but I think it's just good to feel that there's actually a sensible process here. We talk about Lord Wharton of Yarm, but I remember was it a midnight announcement a few years before that where they tried to get Toby Young onto the OFS. It's been a bit crazy, a bit random, and actually it feels like you've got someone who understands the sector and who will be able to actually tackle the in-trace. So yeah, very positive.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, absolutely not someone that's going to try and use this for kind of culture war purposes. I mean, Edward's a sensible person, and he knows a lot about higher education, which is also, you'd have thought, would have been a prerequisite.
Somewhat useful for the role. Yes, somewhat useful.
Yeah. But yeah, on the other other side of the fence then, Ian Chapman, I don't know, but looks like a very serious fellow, as Michael said. And again, he's got a big in trade, doesn't he, Sarah?
He does. And I think a big part of Ian will be thinking, what's next for UKRI in, facing a spending review, facing, really difficult issues with budgets, thinking about a lot of the kind of instability that UKRI has faced over the last few years between what's been coming out of government and just big changes in its own leadership. I mean, we've had a lot of new research council leaders since UKRI was formed. I would like to think that this is the beginning of maybe a period of stability for UKRI, but I think that's going to be a big task for Ian.
Absolutely. I think unsurprisingly, given what I kind of work in and care about, it's the focus, hopefully, on doctoral education that I care about. I was reading Anton Muscatelli and Miles Padgett on Wonkhe recently, talking about the kind of eight critical questions, wasn't it, for the intro here? And look, the reality is UCRI funded doctoral students are a challenge. There's been coverage in the press recently. Overall numbers have been falling since the pandemic. I can't remember the exact numbers, but it's down a few percent the last few years in HESA, and I expect when we get the new stats, it probably won't be much better. So we certainly need some kind of focus there, don't we? And I think we could talk much more about this. I won't hold the mic for too long, but this is about capacity. This is about the future. We've been looking elsewhere, haven't we? At precarity, postdocs, etc. I think a proper strategy for the kind of researcher pipeline, as well as the actual research we're focusing on, will be important. So hopefully that's high up the priority list.
And there's a question about the ref. I mean, much discussed on the pages of Wonkhe. Michael, I mean, it's a fairly small bit of his brief, actually, isn't it? When you put it all together, but there is a live debate happening.
Yeah, I think it sort of speaks to the kind of tone that he'll set and the kind of longer term, leadership of UKRI as a sort of cohesive, but also very, a potentially cohesive, but at the moment quite sort of disparate organisation. I mean, certainly the ref is really more a question for Research England and the other devolved nations sort of university research funding arms. But as Anton has said in his piece, sort of restoring sector confidence in the ref. I mean, if you think about just issues that people are having about how long it's taking to kind of come together, to come into focus what really is going to be needed, and then B, this sort of bigger question of how does it interact with universities up against the wall? When we've seen announcements about universities cutting research time, we've seen sort of taking steps. We talked recently on the podcast about sort of removing protected research time. I think that is going to become probably for the in the lead up to the actual exercise, that is going to become the big story about how does the impact of strange university finances and the inability of universities to cross-subsidize research to the extent that they always have done. How does that interact with research excellence? And that is that big top line thing. That is something that you would want the UKRI chief executive to be speaking to the sector about, perhaps not publicly, but to sort of restoring confidence that the ref is not going to sort of disadvantage universities who are struggling financially. It's not going to become an enormous burden, and all these other things.
Patrick Valent says that he wants UKRI to be less monolithic, but it is difficult, isn't it, Sarah? I mean, it's trying to do a lot of things.
It is, and the question of how agile UKRI can be. I mean, the thing you need in order to be agile really is stability. And that sounds a bit ironic, but you need stability in funding, you need stability in ministerial decisions, you need stability in leadership. And at that point, you're then able to pivot, to start things up, to shut things down as you need to. Right now, UKRI has sort of been in kind of a constant churn for a couple of years. It's been in slight survival mode, I think, for the last year or so. And Patrick understands that. It's one of the great things we've got about having a minister who's so familiar with the sector. But, UKRI is going to need a little bit of time. And I think this new appointment will help to get itself onto firm footing to be able to be less monolithic.
But one of the things I'd want to quickly say, it kind of comes back to some of Michael's points as well. And again, it's in the piece on Wonkhe, isn't it? Looking at the accountability of QR, getting some better scrutiny of that, because you would imagine, wouldn't you, with institutions being in financial difficulty, with challenges around other, funding streams, obviously domestic unit of resource, all the stuff that's going on, and we'll probably talk in a bit about, PGT International and so on. There is a concern, I think it's a fair concern, that QR funding may be needed to cross-subsidize other areas, or that research won't be as well cross-subsidized. So I think when we think about capacity and stability, actually, maybe that's something we need to think again about, what are institutions expected to spend this on? What do they spend it on? Is it actually ensuring a kind of consistent, stable pipeline? I think that's important.
And so some universities are really good about that, right? Some universities are pretty transparent about where their QR funding goes. It is really hard otherwise, if that's not set up, to be able to track it. I think what's an interesting question for UKRI is where QR is given as a kind of compensation essentially for excellent research to departments, on behalf for departments who've done that research, and those departments are now closing, then that poses a really interesting question about, this funding is going in as recognition of something which is not going to be there in the next ref and the next allocation of QR. And so what does that mean?
Yeah, I think the other thing to bear in mind as well, I mean, we're sort of talking about this kind of crunch multi-year spending review coming up. He's not going to be in post when that's announced. I mean, if you sort of read between the lines of the UKRI announcement as opposed to the government one, that, they're already mentioning a sort of interim leadership team to manage the gap between Ottiline Lacer leaving in June and Ian Chapman taking up the reins. So, he is potentially going to have already on his plate a tough financial settlement and an inability to influence that, which in some ways is good because it means he can come in and sort of say, okay, this is what we've got, this is where we're going to go with it. But, as opposed to sort of, as Sarah said, more uncertainty, more sort of, rumors about, is this the year, is this the spending review where research takes a cut, as we seem to hear every single time. He can avoid all of that and come in, maybe in sort of around August is sounding likely, and sort of, look to the future and look to this is what we've got and this is what we need to do.
Right, let's see who's been blogging for us this week.
Hello, my name is Dr. Boyke Leston from the University of Warwick, and this week on Wonkhe, I've been writing about the 100-year partnership between the UK and Ukraine and its implications for the higher education community, with items on innovation, research, and educational leadership development. Co-written with Ivanka Kurtek, Deputy CEO of the Ukrainian Leadership Academy, and Professor of Education Gwen van der Velden, the article celebrates some of the fantastic partnerships that we have seen flourish in the sector over the last few years. It also offers a few ideas for win-win collaborations and reminds us of the power of education and unity during difficult times.
Right, there's been a big increase in students using Gen AI tools and a new report. Mark, walk us through it.
Well, actually, yeah, it's not just a big increase, is it? It's an explosive increase in undergraduates' use of generative AI tools. So,
for headline writers, yeah.
Yes, absolutely. It's a press release, isn't it? It's according to polling for Cortext and the Higher Education Policy Institute. That's HEPI to you and me, with a report published this week. So look, unsurprisingly, most students do use AI in some form, and the proportion doing so has apparently risen from 66% last year to 92% this year. I reckon that's probably broadly true of the population, but there you go. What's really interesting, I think, though, is what the report reveals about why and how different groups of students use AI. So 51% say they use it to save time, and I think we can all relate to that. But actually, only 8% apparently say they use like raw Gen AI output in assessments. So I assume that means, only 8% are submitting wholly generated work without editing. How students use it seems to vary. So it's not just the case, actually, as I've just said, that people are, generating assessed work wholesale, and at least some of the uses, having AI explain a concept, etc. To me, that's just using AI as a learning aid. And, it's not, dare I say, that far removed from Googling something or watching a video on it. But, it seems STEM and medicine students are more confident in using it versus those in arts and humanities, as are men and students from more privileged backgrounds. So we might want to unpack that. 76% feel their institution would spot the use of AI, and 53% are put off from using it by fear of being accused of cheating. Although, again, the headline data suggests that a lot of those are still using it anyway. There are some recommendations, including urging universities to conduct a stress test of their assessments to check they cannot be easily completed using AI.
So it's obviously it's new data, isn't it? It's this hasn't been a survey that's been running for a very long time, and it's not surprising that more students are just reporting this year than last year that they're using Gen AI. But it seems to me, Sarah, that we're still it's quite early days in the sector in terms of unpacking these questions about assessment, and people are still a bit uncertain, aren't they, about how and where they can use these type of things.
Yeah, I think that really came through in the article. Students reporting that they were clear on their university policies where those existed, but that for some students that kind of clarity isn't there yet. And mixed messages, I think, as well, from some who said that their universities were really clear not to use it, but then their lecturers were saying that they were using it. And so I think the sector's opinion and the world's opinion on Gen AI has changed a lot over the last year or two, from a place of kind of fear about what it might mean, fear about how it might be used, to kind of general acceptance and almost embracing the fact that it does exist and it is going to be used. So how do we kind of just set out really clear guidelines for that and embrace it where possible? I mean, a big part of HE is preparing students for the world of work, right? So if AI is going to be a big part of that, of their kind of work life and their careers, then we need to think about how they're using it now so that they're using it well in the future.
I mean, absolutely. I work, our company, I work with engineers, I work with software developers. If they're using AI, of course they are. It's a tool. They absolutely have to. It would be unprofessional at this point not to. And it would be deeply deeply unfair to suggest to students in fields like computer science, and I'm sure no university is doing this really, I hope not. It'd be deeply unfair to suggest to them that, they're not supposed to use these tools. There's way more to software engineering and development than just writing code. There's making code secure, scalable, etc. Humans need to do that, but they need to use the best tools available, and we need to be training them to do that. And there are other fields where it's different. My background is in, my PhD was in Gothic literature. I don't think we should be trying to generate Gothic literature PhDs, but equally, elsewhere in the arts, there will be tasks that it does make sense for a human to create because that's what makes the task valuable. AI can create visual media. Fine, I can request a picture of Cookie Monster riding a bicycle up a mountain, from one of these things. It's great, but I'm more interested in a human painting a picture, not necessarily of Cookie Monster. But, there's value, isn't there, in what humans create, but we should let AI scale what humans can do.
I mean, Michael, it's not surprising that students with more privileged background are using generative AI because some of these tools are quite expensive, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. And especially, there'll often be a sort of freemium, premium split. I mean, we've seen certain universities are sort of paying for certain of these tools to, allow their students to have access. Also, more and more, companies like Microsoft and Google are bundling in their AI tools and also raising their subscription prices by, I think Microsoft just did by quite an enormous amount with the sort of pretext that you now get Copilot included. There's definitely lots of sort of, issues around equity, but there's also, questions around institutional finances and things like that. What can actually be afforded, especially if what your sort of policy recommendation out of this report is all about, universities need to be stress testing their whole assessment portfolio. I mean, I dread to think how many pieces of assessment take place in one university. I think that's something that sounds very good in sort of broad brush terms, but actually, if you think about it in practice, would be really complicated, not least, as you say, that, this would involve universities buying licenses for all the different AI tools, that, testing with both the free and premium versions, really thinking through all the different prompts that students could potentially use. I think it really is quite the undertaking, and it's inevitably something that would just fall on individual academics rather than something that can be done in a sort of institutional way, like, okay, now we're going to do a big audit of all our assessments. I think that's a little fanciful.
Can I really quickly be a little bit maverick on this as well and just say, look, that trying to stress test, I think Michael makes such a good point there. I hadn't actually thought about that, the vast number of tools you'd have to actually purchase and test and so on. But either way, even if it was just ChatGPT, it's still a moving target. It's only going to get better. A task that can, ostensibly cannot be completed using AI today, quite possibly something will drop tomorrow and it will be. That's always been the case and it will continue to be the case. I think actually, rather than stress testing whether current assessments can be completed using AI, we need to be thinking about whether or not they should be. Like, does it matter for a given assessment? Does it matter if a student uses AI and to what extent? And then for those where it really does matter, there are some hard questions to ask about how you can even assess that. Whether we're moving to a point where we have to use supervised assessment for, almost like some sort of Viva scenario for everything, which of course is, horrifically impractical. But for me, that's where I'd be thinking, rather than trying to just, anyway.
Can I come in on the moving target is really interesting because, of course, if you start putting assessments into AI to see if they are AI proof, the AI is going to learn from them. So you're almost, it's like kind of setting yourself up for an own goal. And what was interesting to me in the article is the data around which students are happy to use it or are confident enough to try, even though they're afraid of getting caught. It's an interesting start in there that more people are afraid of getting caught than when willing, therefore, to not use it anyway. And again, switch subjects. So actually, is it that more people are using it in STEM subjects because they're confident too, because there's a higher correlation with kind of male students who are also more confident? Or is it because those assignments are easier to use with AI? I don't know the answer to that, but it does raise an interesting question about, are you going to end up with kind of increasingly divergent types of assessments across different disciplines or across different institutions even because of access to AI and ability to use it?
I agree completely with Sarah. I think, that there'll be some tasks. I would imagine, again, going back to the computer science example, there's just an answer, right? You can just, if you just need to create some code, if that's part of the task on a first year, course, then an AI can just do that for you. So you'll use it. I think probably, I do think the confidence and the gender aspects are important there as well. Actually, there's probably a lot going on. Whereas for, I asked ChatGPT yesterday, I was preparing this, I tried to get it to generate me a BAS. I felt a bit shady doing this, generate me a BA essay on my, a bit of my PhD topic. And it was kind of rubbish, to be honest. Like back in the day when I worked at a uni, I would have given it a third at best, but I was able to make it better with prompting. So, I don't really know where I'm going with that, but I think, there are certainly some tasks, some subjects where you can just use it to get the answer, and others where it's probably harder actually to generate good work.
And that poses a really interesting question about when you can use it for good in HE. So actually, as research funders, we're increasingly thinking about how AI might help alleviate burden of things like peer review, for example, or in recruitment at different organizations, like we're having to stress test our own recruitment questions students to see how much they can be kind of gained with AI. And similar to you, Mark, actually, an AI response to a recruitment question is a middle answer at best, because what you're really looking for is that nuance and the application of understanding. So at the moment, it feels like we're okay, but like you say, it's only going to get better and stronger. And so how do we prepare for that now?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, this idea about, we don't really think that these tools are allowing, just crudely used, are sort of allowing students to sort of, get the highest marks and this kind of thing. But there is a question about how AI has sort of made salient again issues around standards, that, the issue is not necessarily, can AI do better than humans? The issue is, can AI let you get a 2-2 or, pass your degree with little work? I mean, and that is an issue, and it's an issue for students because, that students don't like to see that other students in their cohorts are sort of taking the easy option, and they feel that will devalue their own work. But a lot of these things have always been a problem, and I think that's partly a shame why the survey only looks at undergraduates, because I think some of these issues are quite pronounced in certain postgraduate disciplines.
Oh, absolutely.
But it's always been an issue with things like essay mills and just students getting other students to do their work for them. At least AI is putting these companies out of business. Although, it's then.
Well, I see you say AI, essay mills. Yes, I do definitely see less of them around. You cut this later if you want to. I think back to my own master's. You talk about postgrad. One of my first assessments was to produce an annotated bibliography of critical work on an author, Wonkhe Collins, for what it's worth, right? Some of that, you just wouldn't do today. You still have to, the bibliography was about, you'd write a little kind of, 50-word summary of each piece. And part of that exercise would be valuable because it's about understanding the material and comprehending it and deciding whether it's relevant to your research. But the actual act of producing this kind of reference resource so you could consult and go, oh, right, cool, this critic said this. I absolutely would get an AI to do that now. You'd be mad not to. So, it's really complex. And I would be fascinated to see more data on how postgrads use it. So I bet they do. You'd absolutely summarize journal articles and decide whether it's worth reading. Journal articles take a long time to read, and sometimes they're a bit boring.
Yeah, so numerous members of Team Wonkhe were trying to get to the bottom of the Ian Chapman's research area, weren't they, this week? Michael, what exactly, this different particles doing, and, not being quantum physicists, it's a bit tricky, but ChatGPT could have been helpful.
Well, this is apparently what students are using it for, isn't it? I can't remember, is it 58% say they use it to explain concepts, which, as I said earlier, that's just a learning aid. That's useful. That seems legit to me.
Hello, it's Jim from the team here with news of our exciting student experience event in March. UKHE has a great reputation, but as the resource envelope tightens, it's not clear that what's been sold to students as a higher education experience can compensate for high costs, overcrowded facilities, and stressed out academic and support staff. The result? Widespread health and well-being issues, stubborn awarding gaps, and the erosion of opportunity as demand for higher education begins to slip. Some say the future lies in a great unbundling, but in truth, reports of the death of the full-time 3-year degree have probably been greatly exaggerated. So with a new government, a renewed commitment to access and student success, and a regional regeneration agenda, there's an opportunity to build a different vision for a full-time student experience that acknowledges that students are citizens too. They're passengers, clients, patients, employees, voters, parents, volunteers, and taxpayers, each with their own distinct needs and future potential. So as our unique student experience event returns for its 7th year, we'll try to climb out of the doldrums over the student experience debate, asking the question, what would it take for the UK to offer the world's best student experience? We'll get beyond trying to discern the student interest and work towards an ambitious, positive vision for students' participation in higher education. We'll also spend some time interrogating some of the wicked problems associated with particular groups of students in HE. Disabled students, PGR students, students who live locally or less locally to their campus, and the students whose work-based learning means that even the word student, let alone the policy surrounding them, can seem alien. On the day, we'll round up key findings into the student experience from the past year and launch exciting new findings on the student experience beyond the classroom. It's the essential event for anyone working on policy and delivery for students. That's The Secret Life of Students at the Shaw Theatre in London on the 18th of March. We can't wait to see you there. Tickets and more details on wonkhe.com.
Now, DK's been trying to get to the bottom of the story in the Times about which graduates have been paying back their loans.
So you might have read in the Times in the week a piece entitled "Universities Where Students Are the
worst and best at paying debts. Now, the implications of this piece are genuinely terrifying, but I checked it out, and apparently Neil O'Brien really is opposition education spokesperson. This is the world we live in. He's been filling those long, lonely days by making FOI requests and asking parliamentary questions to get data out of the student loans company. His contention is that there are some universities where graduates go on to get really well-paid jobs and can pay off their loans, and there are other universities where the graduates don't get such good jobs and are not able to pay off their loans in due case. Unfortunately, the data he got was completely useless for making this argument. It didn't stop him from having a go, bless him, but it was data from the beginning of time, or 1998, which is when the SLC kicked off. It didn't break down by subject, by any of the other things you might expect, and we know from the Leo data have an impact. So I had a look at the Leo data and some SLC stuff myself, and I managed to get what I think is a better answer to this question. It turns out the best predictor of how much graduates repay, thus how much graduates earn, is whether or not the institution they studied at has a lot of students from a polar 4 quintile 1 background. So that's students that are least likely to go to university. As we've long suspected, students from disadvantaged backgrounds don't do as well after university, and it's very difficult to see that the university itself has any meaningful impact here. So have a look out for the data, etc. We'll stick it up on Wonkhe at some point. But yeah, that was a moment this week. That's what was the thing that really happened. Now, there's been lots of chatter about the graduate route and post-study work. Sarah, what's going on?
This is an article in The Times reporting that the government is considering ways to ensure that international students are either going to get a graduate job or leave the country after their studies have finished. The current situation, of course, is that international students have those 2 years post-graduation to either find a job sufficiently high-paying for a skilled worker visa, or find a job with a lower salary threshold because it's an occupational shortage, or even move on to another work visa, or they leave. So actually, it's hard to see quite what Labour wants to do here that's different to the status quo. But what's interesting is that the piece in The Times references plans being floated for Labour's upcoming white paper on migration. And it also alludes to apparent tensions between Home Office and Treasury about what the priority is here. Is it growth or is it net migration?
Yeah. So this, as Sarah said, this story had quite a kind of, shocking headline, seeing it doing the daily briefing. I saw it at 6 a.m, forced to leave the UK unless you get a job. I think reading between the lines and having conversations with a few people around the sector, I think this isn't likely to be something about the graduate route itself. This option that students have to spend 2, or for PhD students 3 years, where they're not forced to, have a specific salary. It doesn't sound like that is actually being considered by Labour. It's more they're looking at this issue about what happens next in terms of students moving on to routes which would qualify them for things like indefinite leave to remain and a permanent residency. I mean, it sounds like the government is perhaps looking at doing some tweaks to make that a bit more difficult, to make the salary thresholds a bit higher potentially, or changing what jobs are in scope for certain discounts. Yeah, so I think this is a story that's created a lot of alarm. Perhaps by the sounds of it, the changes are not likely to be too big, but the thing to note, I think, is that, the number of students staying long term in the UK is something the Home Office has still got in its sights, which is a bit of a worry for HE, because that's a big part of, what the UK's offer is to students, is that, they will have the chance to work in the UK afterwards. And as Sarah said, it's also, very important for the economy and just, the kind of cultural health of the UK as well.
How alarmed? I don't know. It's. If it was trying to change the graduate route, I'd be very alarmed, because it would be mad and fundamental. I mean, Michael made the point on Wonkhe, didn't he, that you'd have to introduce sponsorship, or possibly some employers would have to sponsor it, or if you're trying to base it on courses, because what is it? It's courses that typically lead to increased earnings, or so. I can't remember the exact wording for the Times leak, but okay, employers can sponsor that as they do now for the skilled worker route. University sponsoring it would be an absolute rat's nest of complication. But can we just remember this stuff, as if it's the skilled worker, it's already changed. It went up to 38,700 last spring, right, from 26,000, whatever it was. So if I could just soapbox for a second, right, that is 38,700 is actually what an international student with a master's degree needs to earn after 4 years, right? Let's assume they spend 2 years on the graduate route. route with no salary requirement. Then they can spend another 2 years on the lower threshold because they've recently been on the graduate route, right? So after 4 years, it's 38,700 at the minute if they don't put it up. But according to the government's own Leo data, median earnings for a domestic master's graduate are only 36,000 after 5 years. So, international students, unless I'm getting my figures wrong, and I hope I'm not, international students are already expected to earn above the median salary. So, we have to see how it actually gets worded in the white paper. But the idea that there's some sort of, area that after 2 years on the graduate route, 2 years on the, 2 years after, you're not already earning a decent amount in a whatever, a graduate job is, seems a little bit contentious to me.
I really agree with Mark on that. I think that's one of the things I find most frustrating about the way that policy is made. If you look back over the last 5 years and how many tweaks we've had to skilled worker visa in particular, salary thresholds, but also just this, we had this worry from the Migration Advisory Committee last year about who is kind of abusing the system and what might be happening. It's really frustrating as someone who isn't affected by this to see people almost being called out for having used the system appropriately. So we have set thresholds on salary, we've set thresholds on shortage of occupations, and then now we say, well, there's too many people using it. But there are our own thresholds that they're using. So yes, if you want to tweak to change that, then it's understandable. But these are people who are either we've declared as earning sufficient, or we've declared as needed for the economy. So why are we so worried about how many of them there are?
Yeah, it's so true. I mean, if say something like this does happen and, the policy intention achieves its goals and international students are all, going on to sort of high earning graduate level jobs, in 2 years, it's going to be like, oh, they've taken all our jobs, where, I think it's just reactive and, somewhat sort of petty in a way. Like, as you say, sort of, the Home Office has, one time after another made a change, got their impact assessments totally wrong, and then reacted. And, there's people caught up in this in many ways, having their lives made really, really complicated or worse. Lots of these changes, because they are for things that are sort of, for some students many years down the line, these are things that could affect students who are studying now, who've come to the UK with, thinking, okay, this is my route into this career that I've had my eye set on for a very long time. And, but this is, even if this seems like this is a change that hasn't happened yet, it will affect people who are students now if it comes to pass.
Can we also just take a moment to acknowledge just how confusing all of this is? If you go and try and understand, because there's so many exceptions and categories and then tables of occupations and different thresholds and stuff, won't somebody please think of the poor hiring managers and HR departments? And I jest, but it's true. I work for, I am an employer as well as someone who advises students. Hiring people, which is something we would like to do. We would like to hire international graduates rather, where they are the right people for the job. It's incredibly hard and incredibly frustrating. It takes a lot of time, and it's a mess. Don't make it worse.
Yeah, and that confusion for the students. I mean, if you're an international student and you're picking where you're going to go, and you're looking at a country whose visa costs and salary requirements are higher already than most other countries, and it's additionally confusing, and it seems subject to change in the near future, is that an attractive place to come? And at a point when we need, realistically, we need international students for our HE market, we have the potential opportunity to capitalise on some chaos going on over the Atlantic. And what that might mean, is this the time really to send out any signal other than you're very welcome here?
So that's about it for this week. Remember to go in deep on anything we discussed today. You'll find links in the show notes on Wonkhe.com. Don't forget to subscribe. Just search for The Wonkhe Show wherever you get your podcast. And if you want to get ahead of everything that's going on in UKHE, just click subscriptions on the site to find out more. So thanks so much to Sarah, Mark and Michael. We'll be back next week. Jim will be here. Until then, stay wonky.